get ready.
Only one TV channel has so many programs dedicated to cookery,
People, wake up.
gardening, and interiors. UK style TV that brings ideas to life.
Reach Out Highland is the first sexual health charity for the Highlands of Scotland. Established in 1995, their aim is to support all sections of the Highland community, whilst respecting individuals' lifestyle, cultural, religious and personal beliefs, to make informed choices to promote their sexual health and well-being. Reach Out Highland also offer an extensive training package and provide free and confidential services, and may be used anonymously. For more information, contact Reach Out Highland. Telephone Inverness 711 585.
Dundee, a city in crisis. Well, some think so, with the second highest council tax in the country, and new figures which predict that it will lose 15% of its population over the next 15 years. This Thursday on Grampian Midweek, we look to the future for Dundee.
This week, two mums have been spotted behaving flippin' strangely.
There's your chips. And there's your flipper. That's £1.20, please.
Oh, you mad fool!
In training for their big night. Scylla's Moment of Truth, Saturday, 6:20.
Don't miss a moment of it!
Last Saturday on Lily Live,
I've got a tattoo, but I can't show it. It'll be taken off here.
she listened to your problems
He keeps having this off with me pillows.
and dished out the advice.
I wouldn't say that was normal behaviour, would you?
So for stiletto sharp words of wisdom, call Lily live in the studio, Saturday, 9:35.
Dave, can't we just talk about you and me?
The Bill, Friday at 8.
We'll be bringing you highlights of tonight's Champions League matches at 11:30. Meanwhile, it's over to ITN for the nightly news.
Fuel crisis deepens as troops are put on standby. Blair warns real damage has been done to real people. NHS on red alert, operations cancelled and staff shortages. And Siamese twins dilemma, agonising choice for judges.
From ITN, the ITV Nightly News with Dermot Monahan.
Good evening. The government is tonight preparing to use troops in the fuel crisis. Tankers and drivers from the Army, Navy and Air Force are being sent to strategic points across Britain. Earlier, 24 hours after he said things should be getting back to normal, Tony Blair had to admit they weren't. The National Health Service in England was put on red alert, and the Conservative leader William Hague said Parliament should be recalled. Here's our senior political correspondent, Joe Andrews.
Demonstrators at Grangemouth refinery voting tonight not to give up their protest. The sense of national crisis has now intensified, with defence officials saying they're deploying military oil tankers across the country to supply fuel from military depots if necessary.
This is a sensible precaution, but it's not a particular deployment for any particular reason. It's the Army putting itself in a position to be able to supply fuel to essential services where people's lives may be in danger.
If we can't do it by asking the protesters to move away, if we can't do it with the tanker drivers, then I think it's right for the government to be using the troops to do the job.
Military tankers were last used in Britain during the winter of discontent 20 years ago, although the Army were called in 11 years ago during the ambulance dispute. This move is a concrete sign that the government is now close to using its emergency powers to supply petrol.
Real damage is now being done to real people. The idea that a picket at a refinery gate can determine whether hospitals or ambulance services or public transport qualify as essential services or not is an affront.
It's been a frustrating day for Tony Blair, who said yesterday he hoped it would take just 24 hours to start getting things back to normal.
What have the oil companies got to say to the British people?
It hasn't happened, despite calling in the oil chiefs to try to chivvy them into action. And although some have accused ministers of exaggerating this crisis, health authorities were ordered to dust off emergency plans.
The blockaders should go home. They need to know the impact that their actions are having on NHS patients and NHS services. They have made their point, but enough is enough.
The Tories now want Parliament recalled.
I don't think we can go on with this situation without it being properly debated by members of Parliament in the House of Commons.
And for the first time, the protests came to the streets of Whitehall, hooting outside as in the offices contingency plans were hurriedly worked on. Tonight's move is evidence of more preparation, but not yet of action, a sign that the government still hopes to resolve this without direct confrontation. Joe Andrews, ITN at the Ministry of Defence.
Well, some petrol tankers did roll out of the refineries today, but only a fraction of the number needed to restore supplies to normal. Many drivers wouldn't pass through the lines of protesters who are still out tonight and mostly saying they won't give in. Harry Smith has been monitoring developments.
This was the scene a short time ago at the Stanlow refinery near Ellesmere Port. This is where the current wave of protests began. Tonight saw the biggest demonstration there yet. And most of them seemed unimpressed by the Prime Minister's latest intervention.
He's put himself in a corner now, and it's either he sticks through with this, and he's got a job at the end of it, or if it goes to pear-shaped, he's going to be out and not in an election, or he'll have to resign.
I don't think he doesn't know what's going on in the country. You know, I don't think he's got a clue.
Here as elsewhere, tankers have been leaving, but the protesters dispute the government's claims about the amount of fuel getting to the pumps. So how much petrol was delivered today? BP normally makes 560 deliveries. Today it made around 170. Esso usually 500, today 85. Texaco 450, today 34. Total Fina Elf normally 400, today 30. Shell 650, tonight it was just 60. That's an average of less than 15% of normal deliveries from Britain's biggest retailers. Many of the convoys, like this delivery from the Canvey Island depot in Essex, have been escorted by police, but there appear to have been no attempts to stop them. At Avonmouth docks near Bristol, protesters cheered as some tankers turned round rather than cross the picket line.
This is Tony Blair for your
At Sunderland, 2 pickets were arrested, but there's been no other reports of trouble. Protesters have kept up the pressure in other ways. Here it was a go-slow by lorry drivers, bringing chaos for motorists on the M5. And on the River Clyde, Scottish fishermen sailed their boats into the centre of Glasgow to reinforce the message that this protest is far from over. Harry Smith, ITN.
Well, for the latest from the refinery protests, we can now join John Draper in Essex and Linda Kennedy at Grangemouth between Glasgow and Edinburgh. First, John Draper. John, what's the latest with you?
Well, here at the BP refinery at Corriton, there is an indication from at least some of the protesters tonight that they are looking for some kind of resolution to this whole problem. They've been discussing a formula, indeed a number of them voted on it tonight in favour, and they say they're discussing it with other people around the country. And the formula would be this, basically. They're saying that if the government agreed to meet them within 7 days to discuss their concerns, and then the government responds within 60 days to those concerns, that they would be prepared on the basis of that offer to call off their dispute, not just here at Corriton, but right across the country within 24 hours. Now, it has to be said, the government tonight said they knew nothing about this offer, and there's no other confirmation that other people around the country are discussing it. But certainly here at Corriton, they say this is the basis for some kind of formula. And I think the reason for that is because a lot of people here are now starting to say, even the protesters, that perhaps this has gone far enough and it's time to look for a way out of it.
And briefly, John, what's the situation on the ground? Any tanker movements?
Well, this evening there were about 12 tankers that went out. That means over the last 24 hours, that's about 60. But still, they're saying they're only for emergency use for hospitals.
OK, John Draper, thank you very much indeed. Now to Linda Kennedy at Grangemouth. Linda, John was just saying that the possibility of an offer of talks from where he is, are they discussing anything like that where you are?
No, certainly not from where I'm standing have I heard anything like that. The Grangemouth group are still here. The mood is more resolved than ever. They're putting everything to a public vote. The public are those people who have come here to support them. And right now, behind me, there's a meeting that's just finished, and they are looking at whether or not they should allow more emergency vehicles to go through. What they can't agree on is what the definition is of emergency supplies. Is that just hospitals? Is it fire services? Or does it include a wider definition like home helps? So far, they've only allowed or approved the passing of 17 tankers. All of those have been carrying essential supplies. And until they get more idea of what's actually going to be happening in terms of where those supplies are going, they're not going to approve any more going through yet.
Linda, thanks a lot for that. Well, the red alert in the health service, the first for 11 years, appeared to give force to the Prime Minister's warning this evening about lives now being at risk. But just how bad are things? Here's Sue Saville.
In Cardiff, patients wait and hope to see their relatives.
Depends on whether they get the petrol.
The staff are coping, but at a cost.
Well, most of us are car sharing at the moment, if there is anybody with petrol. And we're working 14.5-hour shifts to try and cover for the girls that can't work.
It's community services which are being hardest hit, and tensions ran high at Stanlow Oil Refinery in Cheshire when a health service manager confronted the pickets.
A crisis centre for the region, exactly the same as we would for a terrorist incident. That's the severity of what's going on. And you have no idea what you're doing.
At Avonmouth, another health manager pleaded his case.
I know you have a point to make, but I'm asking you not to make it at the expense of the people in the hospital.
The Department of Health says some hospitals are running short of drugs, food and sterile supplies, and that operations are being cancelled. But several hospitals, Papworth among them, today refuted specific government claims that they're in crisis, and the hospital's representative body said the situation isn't disastrous yet.
Well, I think it's important for people to realise that if they need healthcare right now, the health service is there to provide it. But we need to look ahead. We need to look a few days ahead to say what would happen if the situation got worse.
There's concern tonight that the pressures on the NHS are being used for political ends in this battle of wills between government and protesters. But while most of the NHS is not on the critical list just yet, another few days without fuel could make this a nationwide medical emergency. Sue Saville, ITN, St Thomas's Hospital, London.
And it's not just health services being affected. Some schools will be closed tomorrow and some supermarket shelves are emptying. And the CBI, the employers' organisation, is talking about business grinding to a halt. This report is by Caroline Kerr.
As petrol forecourts stood abandoned today, this dispute began to impinge on almost every individual in the country. Inevitably, the fuel crisis is hitting our transport systems first. It's a familiar scene for motorists.
No petrol.
And petrol, along with patience, is running out.
It's scandalous. It's totally scandalous.
This filling station in York boasted the worst queues in the country, up to 5 miles long with a 2-hour wait. The tanker load came unexpectedly, but within hours 35,000 litres were gone. And it was no easier if you wanted to get a taxi. Here in Southampton there are normally a dozen cabs waiting. This afternoon there were 2, as taxi drivers also ran out of fuel. The rail operators say more people are taking the train, although they're concerned about diesel supplies. British Midland has advised its pilots to refuel abroad when flying into East Midlands Airport. Unlike the bigger airports, it doesn't have fuel piped in directly. The crisis is causing huge concerns about food. Sainsbury's said tonight it was likely to run out of food in days rather than weeks. Smaller outlets have already run out of some fresh produce. Retailers say they're having great difficulties getting supplies through at a time when demand has soared. Schools are also being hit. These pupils have been told to stay at home tomorrow. Their local council in South Wales has closed all 19 of its secondary schools because not enough teachers can get to work. And tonight, the impact of the fuel crisis on business is also becoming apparent. The haulier Eddie Stobbart says he's taking 700 lorries off the road out of a fleet of 900 because they've run out of fuel. He says it'll cost him £250,000 every day. The Post Office says deliveries are now facing serious disruption as it struggles to provide basic postal services. And the CBI says business in general will be crippled by the end of the week.
All our members have been ringing in today from different sectors, different businesses all across the country. They're all going to be grinding to a halt on Friday. The fuel's running out, and we're not going to get goods in the shops, we're not going to get goods onto building sites, we're not going to get just-in-time deliveries being made to the lines, and Friday is crunch day. It's a very serious issue.
It's only if you're providing nightlife that the crisis is good news. Pubs and nightclubs report an increase in their custom as more people stay in city centres overnight to avoid making unnecessary journeys.
Luckily, the major brewers have their own fuel supplies and say they have sufficient stocks to keep the beer flowing readily until the beginning of next week. Caroline Kerr, ITN, Central London.
Well, over now to our political editor, John Sargent. John, everyone on these protests seem to be saying all they want to do is talk to the government. Would that be too much for number 10?
I think it would be very unlikely. Throughout the dispute, Mr. Blair has made it quite clear that he won't talk to protesters. That's being said on his behalf. And also today he was extremely critical of them, talking about intimidation, not the way to behave, not the way to take decisions. Pickets shouldn't be deciding what are essential services. So it would be a very sharp turn in tactics if he was to talk to protesters.
And is Mr. Blair's dilemma that in spite of the increasing shortages, public opinion still doesn't seem to be very supportive of him?
No, it doesn't. ITV tonight asked viewers what they thought of Mr. Blair's performance, and an amazing more than 600,000 took part, and 94% of those said Mr. Blair was not doing a good job. So the battle for public opinion is certainly not being won by the government. Of course, there are other questions you could ask, and that's what ministers are saying. If you ask different questions, you'd get a different response. But there's no doubt with that level of being the public clearly unimpressed by what Mr. Blair has done so far, it makes it very much harder for him to get to grips with this dispute, because of course he does have to win the argument, and that's what he needs to persuade everyone from tanker drivers and everyone else to bring the dispute to an end.
John Sargent in Downing Street, thanks a lot. To other news now. In the case of the Siamese twins born in Manchester last month, returned to the Court of Appeal today. The judges, who say they've had sleepless nights over it, heard new medical evidence and decided to let the head of the Roman Catholic Church in England and Wales tell them why he believes the sisters should both be allowed to die. Lawrence McGinty reports.
Amid all the complex legal arguments in the case of the Siamese twins, the human tragedy is still all too obvious, especially for the anonymous parents who want nature to take its course.
I'm not really able to discuss how the parents are reacting to it all, but I can say it's common sense that obviously it is very, very stressful and difficult for them.
Doctors say the twins are still in a stable condition, but Mary, the weaker twin, is growing faster, possibly drawing nutrition from Jodie. She would survive an operation to separate the twins. Mary will die, whatever the doctors do.
This is possibly the sharpest dilemma ever to face the Court of Appeal. If they don't allow the operation to go ahead, both twins will surely die. If they do, could that be seen as murder of the weaker twin Mary, who would then inevitably perish? It's an unenviable decision the three judges must make. Lawrence McGinty, ITN, at the Court of Appeal.
The Millennium Commission has confirmed that it will go ahead with grants totalling £77 million to keep the Dome open until the end of the year. The announcement came a day after the Japanese bank Nomura pulled out of its proposed bid to rescue the failed attraction. The Millennium Commission said it was cheaper to keep the Dome open than to close it. Both Manchester United and Leeds United had important opening matches in the Champions League tonight. Highlights will be on ITV later, so look away now if you don't want to know the scores. The main headlines again. The government is preparing to use military tankers and drivers in the fuel crisis after a warning by the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, that real damage was now being done and lives were at risk, and the health service in England has been put on red alert. Tonight's financial figures. The 100-share index in London was in retreat for the 7th straight day. It closed 77 points down, at its lowest for 4 weeks. On Wall Street, the Dow finished 51 points lower, and the pound is up 1/3 of a cent against the American dollar. Now for a look at tomorrow's front pages, and of course they all